Very good. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Michael Osterman. I'm the president of Osterman Research, and we're here today to bring you proactive information governance for cybersecurity, e-discovery, and compliance. The webinar is sponsored by HP, and we'll be discussing some issues that we think are very relevant, really to pretty much everybody that's in a mid-level or larger organization. We're focused really on security issues, e-discovery and compliance, and really the umbrella of information governance that really should concern us all and is a critical issue for just about every organization out there. We are recording today's webinar, and let's get started. I'd like to start by introducing the speakers, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Dominic, why don't you start and tell us a little bit about your background and what you do with HP?
Sure. I am Dominic Brown. I'm Vice President of Information Governance for HP Big Data, and I'm essentially a subject matter expert for archiving, e-discovery, cybersecurity, and compliance. Been really doing archiving, e-discovery, compliance for about 15 years. I've got legal domain expertise. I used to work for the General Counsel at ENC Corporation on their e-discovery. And I also have a technology background. I have a master's degree in computer science from Harvard University, so I like to combine the technical knowledge with the legal domain experience to really help our customers with compliance, e-discovery, and cybersecurity requirements. Thank you.
Great. Dominic, thank you very much. Alan, could you tell us a little about yourself, please?
Sure. Well, I'm a lawyer in New York City. I practice and lead our firm's e-discovery and cybersecurity practice areas, and have been doing this probably for 25 years now. E-discovery, maybe not 25, but at least for the last 20 years, and the cybersecurity more for the last, I guess, 7 or 6 years. The main areas we see in this area are large mass torts, and then in the cybersecurity we're seeing it in an increasing number of breaches. And a sort of a common thread, and why I think this is such an important topic for everyone, is a lot of this seems to be preventable through enhanced information governance. So I'm very happy to be here and at least share our experience in that area.
We are an independent market research and consulting firm very focused on the messaging, web, and collaboration space. Our focus really is on any technology or process that helps organizations to communicate or collaborate more effectively. We have a very strong emphasis on primary research. We'll be going into a little bit of that today. We talk really to decision makers and influencers, and our goal is to understand how organizations work, how they manage their information, the kinds of problems that they like to solve, and so forth. The company is about 14 and a half years old, and we're based near Seattle, Washington. So the fundamental problem that we'll be dealing with here today is really one that cuts across just about every industry, just about every organization, and that is we have too much data and we have too little management of it. We're generating data in all sorts of data stores, things like email and CRM, social media, files, you name it. And the list really keeps getting longer and longer. And we just don't have the information governance processes in place to deal with this information, to process it effectively, to protect ourselves from a cybersecurity perspective, from an e-discovery perspective, and so forth. And so fundamentally what we need is good information governance, and not enough of us have it today. So this came from the Compliance, Governance, and Oversight Council back in 2012. And what they found is that the vast majority of information, almost 70%, is really valueless information. It's expired data, it's copies of business records, revisions, transitory data, sort of meaningless emails, and so forth. So the bulk of the information that we keep around really doesn't have any true business value. Now, about 25% of information actually does have some business value, and it's the kind of stuff that we do need to preserve and that we do need to manage effectively. A small proportion of information, about 5%, and of course this is going to change significantly based on the industry you're in, the size of the company you're in, and so forth, but there is a small proportion that's subject to regulatory requirements, and finally about 1% of information is subject to litigation hold. And again, these proportions are going to vary based on your particular case, but this is a good average for typical mid-sized and large organizations. So fundamentally what we're talking about is that most data really has very little value to an enterprise, but enterprises spend enormous amounts of time, money, and effort managing all of this information. So we're wasting a lot of effort, we're wasting a lot of time, and most importantly, we're wasting a lot of money while adding risk to the overall information management process. Now, in terms of the state of information governance today, this came from a recent survey that we did. We asked organizations if they had started an information governance program. And as you can see here, slightly more than half actually have started some sort of an information governance program. 20% have not, but they actually plan to within the next year. And about a quarter of organizations just have not done it and really have no plans to do it. So this is encouraging from the perspective of being able to look forward and say, okay, most organizations are at least at some level thinking about how they're going to manage their information, how they're going to implement an information governance program, and deal with this growing flood of information that we all face. Now, in terms of the information governance issues to address, there are really quite a few of them. First, the vast majority of data in the typical enterprise is unstructured. It's emails and files and various types of unstructured databases outside of a traditional database. That makes it more difficult to manage, more difficult to index and categorize, and so forth. And most of this data really is, quote unquote, managed by employees. They manage it on their desktops, laptops, file servers, cloud file sync and share tools, and so forth. And so it's not really managed at a corporate level in an organized way according to corporate policies and really with the best interests of the organization at heart. Also, a lot of this data is just not easily accessible to the company at large. Again, it's stored in a variety of locations that are really outside the control of IT or legal or compliance, and it's really just scattered all over the organization, but more damagingly, it's scattered in the cloud and in various locations that the organization really can't get access to. That makes storage and discovery costs excessive, and corporate risk continues to increase largely because a lot of this information simply isn't available. What we've shown in other surveys is that about 5% of all corporate data is stored on mobile devices. And much of that simply is not available to the organization at large. Decision makers, compliance, what have you, just don't have access to that information. Also, a growing proportion of corporate data is stored in things like Dropbox, employee-managed file sync and share stores. And so the organization really doesn't have access to a lot of this data. And a lot of this data, although if it's stored in a file sync and share tool, is also copied maybe on a file server or a desktop somewhere, very often it's not. An employee might create something on a mobile device, put it into a cloud-based file sync and share tool, and it never hits the corporate network. And so the organization doesn't even know it exists, let alone being able to find it. Now, in terms of the costs, as you can see here, this came from a survey by RAND. What they found is that the annual discovery cost of all required data, the stuff that the organization absolutely has to keep, continues to go up over time. And discovery cost for required data increases over time really because you have to store more and more of it. Storage is going up conservatively at 25 to 30% per year for most organizations. In some organizations, it's much faster than that. So the costs of the stuff that you really have to keep continues to go up. But the annual discovery cost of excess data is even higher than that. All of this superfluous stuff, the 69% we saw on that pyramid chart, continues to grow at an even faster pace simply because there's so much of it. And so the costs for preserving all of this content grow dramatically, and it not only increases the cost to the organization, but it also increases the risk that they face as well. Now, there are a variety of information governance issues to address in addition to the ones we've talked about. First, as data ages, a couple of things happen. First, as we've discussed, the amount of that data increases, and also the likelihood of reusing it decreases. For example, if you've got a presentation that's 3 months old, it's likely that somebody's going to go back and access that information, maybe if they're creating a new presentation. But if it's 5 years old, the chances of that are very, very low. So you're storing this information, you're paying for it, and you really get no business value out of it. Also, without an information governance strategy and infrastructure, the cost of useful information skyrockets, because now you've got to wade through all of this superfluous stuff to get to the information that you really do want. So employee productivity suffers because they can't find the information they need as quickly as they need it, and also defensible disposition becomes a key issue that a lot of decision makers are not adequately addressing. We find that most organizations do a reasonably good job at establishing retention policies, but relatively few have established disposition policies so that they're getting rid of data that they no longer need. And so that not only increases the cost of managing information, it also increases the risk of preserving content that somehow could come back to bite you in a regulatory audit, a lawsuit, and so forth, particularly when you don't need to preserve that information after a certain period of time. Now, cybersecurity is also an important issue with respect to information governance. We asked a question in a survey recently: has your organization ever been the target of the theft of sensitive or confidential data? Now, what we found is that about 3 out of 5 said no, they hadn't been the victim of that kind of data theft, but 24% told us yes by one or more outside parties. 19% said that they had some sort of an inside job, that an employee or more than one employee had stolen data, but 6% weren't really sure who had stolen their data. So what we find here is that over a third of organizations have had the theft of sensitive or confidential data, and in large part this is because they don't have good information governance practices in place. They don't know where all this data is, they're not controlling it, they're not encrypting it, and so to all of these different kinds of threats. And fundamentally, the lack of good information governance is really a key contributor to data loss. If you don't have information governance in place, you're more likely to have this kind of data loss. So in summary, there's really 4 critical information governance issues that organizations need to address. First, they need to address data volume. Data volume is really out of control in a lot of organizations, and they need to get that data under control. They also need to focus on the various formats in which data is stored. There are a growing number of different types of data formats in email, files, CRM databases, what have you. That has to be managed in accordance with a good information governance strategy. Also, the speed of data creation, capture, storage, and distribution is growing at a very rapid pace. That needs to be brought under control with a good IG strategy. And finally, you need to protect data. You need to protect it from theft because there's an enormous amount of sensitive or confidential information that organizations possess, and it is ripe for the picking if organizations don't manage it appropriately with a good information governance strategy. So the bottom line here is that an information governance strategy and the infrastructure needed to support it is absolutely essential, regardless of the size of the organization or the industry that you serve. Okay, here is our contact information. We'd be happy to talk with anybody at any time about these issues. And at this point, I would like to turn things over to Dominic. Dominic, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I'll press on then. So we're going to talk a little bit about trends across industries and our customer challenges and concerns. So Michael, if you could page down. Can you page down? There we go.
Yes.
Okay.
There we go.
Sorry about that. Just getting used to the latency there, I guess. So I'll just build on what Michael was talking about. So I'm part of HP Big Data. And big data is an opportunity, but compliance and eDiscovery also can be a problem, right? So how big is big? We all know about megabytes, gigabytes, and terabytes. I remember when a terabyte seemed big. When I worked at ENC, we used to do our financial planning by just counting the terabytes that were out there to see how much storage we could sell. But now I have lots of customers I walk into that have petabytes of data out in their file shares. petabyte is a lot of data. So a petabyte of unstructured data is analogous to 20 million four-drawer file cabinets filled with paper. And who knows, pretty soon we'll be talking about exabytes and yottabytes. A little stat here that an exabyte of data is created on the internet each day, which is equivalent to 250 million DVDs worth of information. So the point here is this data is growing exponentially. 80% of it is unstructured or human-generated information. So it essentially doesn't fit neatly into rows and columns like database data does. Rather, it's made up of thoughts, ideas, concepts, slang, some of which relate and some of which don't. And it really can be in any format, as Michael was talking about. It can be an email, IM, social media, audio, video, and so forth. So this is really difficult for computers to understand. They essentially need to think like a human being to be able to make sense of this data for information governance. Michael, if you could page down, please. So the HP platform for human-generated information is IDLE. And IDLE is the core technology that all HP Big Data platform solution technology runs on. And it's really a unique combination of mathematical algorithms, Shannon's information theory, coupled with powerful pattern matching so that IDLE can form a conceptual and contextual understanding of all enterprise content, and then it can automate business processes based on that understanding. So it stores that understanding in a common index across enterprise repositories as well as our governance solution. So it actually started out in 1996 as the first conceptual enterprise search engine. So a good way to think of how IDLE works is think of the word apple, right? The multiple derivations of apple. You could have Apple, the shiny red fruit. You could have Apple, the technology company, and Apple Records, if you're as old as I am, right? The Beatle record label. So IDLE understands the different derivations of the word apple. It also understands the nearness of ideas. It understands that like a banana and an orange is more closely related to Apple the fruit, iPad, Apple the computer company, and John, George, Ringo, and Paul, closer to Apple Records. So it takes this deep understanding of unstructured data and then is able to automate governance business processes based on that understanding, and we'll show you how that works as we go through this presentation. If you could page down again, Michael. So this is a slightly different take on pretty much a similar slide that Michael showed, and it just gives you the breakdown of big data. It's the same percentages. Here you've got 1% of information that is on litigation hold, 5% subject to a records category, 25% is really content that's in the active phase of its life cycle. Folks are collaborating on it and creating new content. And then 70% really has no business, legal, or regulatory value. The essentially dark legacy data. And the reason why this 70% is here is because organizations don't have a view into their data. So they're required to put any information that's relevant to a legal hold on hold, or relevant to a case rather on hold. So they end up holding everything, and that's where you get the 70% of this dark data. And it relates to the petabytes of data sitting on file shares. Many customers have backup tapes stacked in closets. Terabytes upon terabytes of image hard drives. So you could page down. So this leads us to a lot of what we're seeing in the marketplace, right? So what our customers are talking about is legal and regulatory costs and risks. And we talked about legal hold. If you think about legal hold, it is the one governance requirement that every organization, private sector, public sector, has, no matter what. No matter who you are, folks have a legal hold requirement. And it's very difficult. There's a lot of cost and a lot of risk, and most of this is due to the legacy data. If you don't implement the hold properly, you could be subject to sanctions from the courts. If you delete data or alter data or fail to hold data, these sanctions can occur. They can be monetary. They're pretty big. They've been in the billions of dollars. Or they can be in the form of an adverse inference where you're assumed guilty until proven innocent, which is also very difficult. And then there's the eDiscovery costs, right? So the fact that there's so much data out there, Gartner has a stat that the cost of an average eDiscovery is $2 million. 90% of the data that gets collected for eDiscovery is irrelevant, right? And it's the same for government investigations, and it's the same for public records requests. The ironic thing here is that nobody's really looking at the data until it gets to eDiscovery, and then folks start looking at it to figure out what's relevant, and they happen to be the most highly paid people in the organization, which are the lawyers at about $400 an hour, right? So it's a big problem. So then there's cybersecurity, right? And the trend is really insider threats. Most organizations are focused on protecting the perimeter, but we'll take a look at some of the most recent data breaches, and insider threats pose the greatest danger, and that's really due to once someone gets inside the organization, there are no real layers of security within the network, and information governance goes a long way to creating these layers of security. And then it's the sensible deletion. You know, I've got this 70% of data that has no value. It's causing me eDiscovery risk and cost and cybersecurity risk and cost. How do I get rid of that stuff? I'll give you one eDiscovery example. I've got a customer up in northern Ohio, a big manufacturer. They thought they had a deal with the IRS in terms of their Caribbean subsidiaries in terms of taxes. So they got a $700 million tax bill from the IRS. They said, wait a minute, we had a deal. IRS said, well, prove it. So they went to their SharePoint, their file shares, their email, their content management system, their records management system, and they couldn't find the information. They had to pony up the $700 million. So what we're doing for them is we're implementing an archive, a combination archive, document management, records management that's going to be able to consolidate all those repositories so they have one place to go to find that information, and it will also be the same place for eDiscovery and compliance requirements as well. Michael, if you could page down, that'd be good. I think there's a little latency, Michael. Is it?
Yeah, I apologize for that. It has moved to the next slide. It's just not showing.
Oh, that's okay. There we go. So talk a little bit about big data risk here in the form of cybersecurity. So this, what you see on the slide here, is what Sony employees saw on their computers when they came into work last December. And no, they were not hacked by the Republican Party. They were hacked by what the acronym is the Guardians of Peace, who allegedly did this hacking. But it's not just Sony. What we're seeing in the marketplace is that organizations typically focus their cybersecurity efforts around protecting the perimeter, right? Firewalls and penetration tests and things like that. And those are incredibly important. But if you look at the recent data breaches, what they do is they show insider threats that exploit the lack of security layers within an organization's network where an organization is most vulnerable. So if you look at Sony data breach, right, that was a stolen password. IRS data breach, stolen authentication. U.S. Office of Personnel Management, credentials stolen from a contractor. So in all these cases, the hackers use unprotected insider information as a gateway for stealing extremely sensitive information. And this really has been going on since the beginning of time. It's human nature, right? It's not likely to change. The Romans even had a saying for it. I'm not going to say it in Latin because I can't, but it translates to, who will guard the guards themselves, right? So information governance goes a long way to do that. I'll just describe one of these breaches that one of these companies had. Essentially, what the hackers did once they got into the network and they had the credentials to get in the network, they installed a malware that instead of corrupting data or damaging data, it copied it. And it copied it to the tune of 100 terabytes, right? And then since the breach, the hackers periodically dumped chunks of data on information sharing hubs like FriendPaste and Pastebin. And from there, WikiLeaks has copied the data, indexed it, and posted it online. So it's extraordinarily damaging. I mean, there was 1.1 million Social Security numbers before deduplication arrived. The chairman of the board's Social Security numbers were found in 104 separate locations, while the CEOs were found in 93 separate files. And they're basically unencrypted Excel files in unmanaged repositories throughout the organization. And you add to that, employee salary information, home addresses, damaging emails, and the damage was severe. In terms of money, it cost about $70 million to rebuild the organization's networks, and there's a class action lawsuit from the employees complaining that they didn't have their information protected. So, and we'll talk about this in detail, but the point is that information governance, by virtue of its core tenets, like data confidentiality, protecting data, accessibility, controlling who has access to where, and only that the right folks have the right access to the right data at the right time, and data integrity, ensuring that data purports what it is to be, goes a long way to thwarting these insider threats and providing those layers of security within an organization. Michael, if you could page down. So just take a quick look at additional costs, right? So you've got the cybersecurity, and the flip side of that, you've got eDiscovery. You've had eDiscovery for a while as well as cybersecurity. So this is an analysis that DuPont did in an effort to get their senior management to embark on an information governance program. So they looked at a single litigation, and they realized they reviewed 75 million pages of text during a 3-year period. 50% of this data was content kept beyond its retention period. So it's essentially 50% of that data, rather. It's essentially that dark data that we were talking about earlier, right? So reviewing these documents past the retention periods amounted to $12 million, right? So it's significant cost. So at this point, I'd like to, and this is a pretty good juncture for Alan to jump in. So Alan is an HP Big Data customer. I'd like to pass it to Alan just to talk about some of his experience and his knowledge on this topic.
Sure, thanks, Dominic. Let's pop to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the information governance strategies that we're seeing in our clients and what they're doing. And to Dominic's point, we are a big data customer. We run IDLE in-house here and use it to try to find meaning out of client data and to some extent our own data also. And it is remarkable, and I know Dominic's going to go back and talk some more about it, but it really is, I think, a big essential part of the solution to this. But when we look at most companies, they approach information governance as a tremendous cost. It's something that they don't intuitively want to do. And part of that is training. Since PCs and computers have come around, we started from a PC mentality where you'd create a document on the computer and then print it because no one ever conceived of having storage media like disks like we have now of such size that people could actually store all their content online. I mean, when Microsoft and others first came out with a PC, they had like 10 megabyte drives, and most of them were floppy disks that booted up by the operating system. And so all the applications and all the programs we run, like Word, Excel, and so forth, were never really developed with a retention strategy in mind. The retention was to be printed to paper. The electronic content would be deleted, and the paper would be managed pursuant to traditional record management strategies. But the advent of cheap storage and the ability to communicate so much information over the internet through email and the like really allowed for so much information to come in that people found it easier to just sort of leave it there and go back and search for it. I mean, that was Google's idea with email, right? Don't folder, save it, and then search for the ones you want to find. But unfortunately, that really is anathema to any sort of record management information governance practice that companies are supposed to employ. And to Dominic and Michael's point, as the amount of data has grown to such astronomical proportions, the impact is now being felt, and you're kind of coming up to that pay the piper situation where, for the companies that have gone into the save everything, we'll sort it out later strategy, as the DuPont slide before shows, you pay for that. And then a minority of companies, at least in the clients we have, I guess the leadership has become so fed up with the whole thing and eDiscovery bills and the like, they're trying to come up with a policy where basically we will delete everything, and then we won't need to bother with litigation costs. So you have the sort of the atlas trying to hold up all the data, and then the information not found, the 404 link you see on your website, has the two strategies here. Let's flip to the next slide. So both of these strategies are, I guess, ultimately legally defensible in the sense that if you write a policy and you don't require, you say everyone, you can basically delete everything that you have unless there's a specific regulatory requirement to keep it. You can do that, but it has its problems, and conversely, save everything. I can, find a way to write a policy to defend that as well, but there are real risks and costs that come to both of them. From the save everything side, you have, I think, a tremendous storage and functional costs that you're going to pay for later, because if people just keep everything and don't delete it, you end up with multiple versions of documents that purport to communicate the same information, yet some are stale, some are current, some have parts that are current and parts that are stale, and ultimately everyone is confused and no one knows what is the real data for their companies because they have the same information or versions of it stored in so many different places they don't know where to go. The legal fees, unlike Dominic and Michael, I find just fine. I mean, go ahead. They should rack up as high as they can be, but then I'm a lawyer, so I guess I have a conflict of interest on that one. But the legal fee perspective is really something I think companies need to take into account when they are weighing whether or not they want to invest in information governance, because there is an investment cost, but I promise you it's a lot cheaper than the eDiscovery, the cybersecurity, and the regulatory costs. And just to put that into context, I think the DuPont number is an amazing number, but most people looking at it would say, but that's not us, that's DuPont, especially if you're a smaller company. And I think that's a staggering number as well. I'm not quite sure how it got that lopsided, but it did. But I can give you some stats that this is coming out of our data. When we look at a gigabyte of data for information we collect, that corresponds to about 3,000 documents. And when I look at our associates or contract lawyers or even folks, if we outsource it to India, I find that if we hop them up on enough amphetamines, caffeine, oxygen in the room, and so forth, they can get through perhaps 500 documents a day, sometimes 600, sometimes a little bit less. It depends on the complexity of documents. So you're looking at 6 days of attorney time to review each gigabyte of data. And if you're paying about $100 an hour for the contract lawyers, the project management, everything else that sort of goes into it, that comes out to about $6,000 per gigabyte for Tier 1 review. That's a lot of money because the average custodian has many gigabytes of data. You're looking at $6,000 for each. It can really add up quickly. And that's any client. That's not just DuPont. Those are just regular run-of-the-mill companies with 5 to 10 employees. So, and then you still have the case team then looking after the Tier 1 review to look at it. So the doc review cost and litigation cost can be staggering, and you just need to figure that in. If you're not going to do information governance, or you're thinking, what's the cost of information governance? You've really got to look and say, well, what is the cost of not doing it? On the same side, and this is sort of the flip side of saving everything, I have, in cases that we have at least, seen a lot of really stupid emails that did very little to advance the defenses or the claims in the case and probably undermined them dramatically. I mean, I had one bunch of cases that were the diet drug, fen-phen, and there was a very famous email in that one from finance to medical monitoring where someone wrote, am I out of the woods yet? Or am I going to writing checks to fat women with some silly lung disease for the rest of my career? Well, that email was sort of a gallows humor email, but it didn't work. It wasn't funny, and it certainly wasn't funny when used at trial exhibits, and a lot of money was paid in those cases. And that email served no business function whatsoever. It didn't need to be kept. If there had been a proper information retention policy, it would have been deleted very quickly, but of course it was kept, and when the litigation came, that email was produced, and even though it wasn't the business record of the client, it was produced, and it caused a lot of mischief for them. So you have a tremendous liability risk. And then as the folks are going to cover, there's also an information security risk. If you save everything, you're going to save them typically where you got them. Now, one of the places so much information comes in, at least we find for the clients we're working with, is it's coming into their email servers. And people are saving everything in folders. Maybe, if we're lucky, they're saving them in folders, or more typically, they're saving them cleverly in the inbox. And if they're very clever, they organize it in such folders as 2015, 2014, 13, 12. And the problem with that is emails are very open source, right? So if you think about how you get to your emails, most people have access on their email client on their desktop, right? Outlook or whatever you're using. But they also have email access through their PDA, and many businesses have a bring your own device policy, and they have maybe bad apps on their PDAs that now have access through the PDAs into the email servers, and your PDA becomes a real source through that, once thought to be in volatile firewall. You also have things like Outlook Web Access, where people going into a hotel with some sort of horrible virus on the hotel software, they're now connecting through Outlook Web Access and again going into their emails. So if you think about all the places that you're now opening up your corporate information, it's not a great strategy to just leave everything where they came in. The converse, of course, is delete everything. And I guess from a litigation standpoint, I'd maybe prefer that in the sense that if I have good witnesses to testify, I could prep them to answer questions right, and they'd never have to be cross-examined by a bad document. But truth be told, it doesn't work out that way. First of all, it's very hard to enforce it. People are by nature kleptomaniacs, particularly with information, and if you tell them they have to delete their content off the servers after 30 days or something like that, they find ways to archive it to USB drives, hard drives, floppy disks, CD-ROMs, DVDs, to some Dropbox that Google provides for free. God knows what. But they put the information everywhere. And then when you go do your custodial interviews as part of litigation, some guy comes forward and says, yeah, I got everything. It's right here in my drawer. And the company had no idea they did, so you don't have good management over your data, and you have people that are basically hoarding data. So, if you think you're deleting everything, you're probably not. And then ultimately people leave companies, so I don't have that witness to testify, so I really do need the documents, at least the real documents help me, and you lose institutional knowledge. So while delete everything is perhaps initially an attractive solution, I don't think it's a good one. The better way is to institute information governance and put the data where it belongs. If we go to the next slide. People say, what is information governance? And I kind of wanted to, this is how I think about it, and probably Michael and Dominic have a better idea of it, but at least this is where I'm coming from. When I think of information governance, I think of initially records management that we've had all along, where we manage the life cycle of a document, where we create it, we use it, we retain it, and then ultimately it dies and gets deleted. Although with digital world, that's not a necessarily good assumption. The next thing you have is that you have an important piece, and when you look at the name, it's information governance, there's the concept of governance. So what I'd add to information governance when you put it in is you have a framework and a set of rules to influence the behavior of the people in the company and to create accountability for rewarding or modifying bad behavior for that. And so what you need to then build into it is the idea of data privacy and security. So it's amazing, if you think about when you go to your doctor, right? They're always asked for your Social Security number or driver's license, and you got to wonder, why do they want that? Well, clearly it has to do with collections, but it doesn't really help them. And now a doctor's sitting on your Social Security number and is creating this risk, and it's really not secured. You look at your own systems, how many places are you storing, Social Security numbers associated with a person's name in an Excel spreadsheet in your inbox, where you have no information security, and if your inbox is breached or hacked, and it probably has been, statistically it has been, people just don't know it, you have a notification duty now to most everyone on that spreadsheet, because pretty much every state requires notification to people when their state identification number or tax ID and their name is released, or a credit card. I mean, all this information is unencrypted, resting in environments. Access controls. If you have good information governance, it should address things like physical, logical, and administrative access control, where physical is, are your doors locked? You control people's abilities to get in and out of spaces. You have a logical access in the sense of, do your computers time out? Do you have a strong enough password? Is data encrypted in different places? And administrative in the sense of, do the right people and only the right people have access to the information in your system? You need to have legal compliance and regulatory policies that are the bread and butters for lawyers to create now in this area. And there's a robust area on the internet. We don't have enough time to go into it here, and it's this whole other topic, but you need to have policies that kind of go into how you're going to manage the data. You need to have storage solutions that address how you're doing it. Are you going to put it in a cloud environment and rely upon vendors with real skill sets in this area, or do you believe that you can do better hosting the data in your own internal networks, and how you're going to provide it and what type of servers you're going to put it in? That's something that you have to really build into information governance. And then finally, I think an area that's often forgotten is metadata management, where you send files out, but there's metadata in it, and you're not aware of what that metadata is, so you really need to build that kind of management. And now that I've queued up Dominic really high, I'm going to tee it back to him to sort of say some of the technology solutions can address these problems.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alan. So, Michael, if you could page down.
Okay, we should.
Yeah. Sure. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some technology solutions to support information governance. So this is the HP Big Data Governance Platform, and at the bottom you've got IDLE. We talked about IDLE. So IDLE can connect you and understand your enterprise repositories, and then as we discussed, we're going to layer applications on top of IDLE. So one, and we'll get into detail, is the data mapping and compliance assessment. So take a look at that dark data, figure out what it is, figure out what to do with it, right? Classify it, apply policy to it, delete it if we can delete it, right? We can take data and move it to our content management and our records management systems and our archive, do eDiscovery, legal hold, and early case assessment, or we can do it where the data sits, right? And we're also going to protect data, right? We're going to encrypt it, and we're going to back it up. And I'll go into some details on this. Michael, if you could page down, please. So really the first step, your mileage may vary, but a logical first step is to look at that 70% of that data that's causing you all this pain. And what organizations want to know what they have, they want to know where it is, who has access to it, keep what you need to keep, and get rid of the acronyms ROT, which is redundant, obsolete, and trivial. So we have solutions that will do this for both structured data, so database data, and what we've been talking about primarily today, unstructured data. So we'll take a look at this data, do an analysis, right? Is it a record? Does it have PII or PCI or PHI or whatever the acronym you choose? Then it can take action, right? If it's rot, it can delete it in place defensively. There's a whole business process for the integrity of that delete process. Or take action, write it to a records management system. If it's a record, write it to the archive to consolidate it for eDiscovery, and we can do this in the cloud and on-premise. Michael, if you could page down. So, archiving for data consolidation, compliance, and eDiscovery. So I talked about that manufacturing company up in Ohio. So what a lot of organizations are doing to mitigate eDiscovery cost and risk is they're aggregating content repositories into an archive. So rather than have 8 different eDiscovery processes for all these different data repositories, we'll capture this information on a regular basis, deduplicate it, index it, encrypt it, and then make it available for legal hold, defensible deletion, eDiscovery, culling, filtering, as well as information lifecycle management. So the archive becomes a repository of record where you do your legal holds and your eDiscovery first pass search, cull, and review, rather than an eDiscovery process for each repository. Michael, if you could page down. And Alan was talking about this. So we can do a deep dive into content for eDiscovery, right? So deep conceptual dive. So a lot of our customers are doing in terms of eDiscovery, they're using IDLE to do things, term predictive coding, right? So attorneys with subject matter expertise on a case will look at a responsive set of data, a rich set of data relevant to the case, feed that to IDLE. IDLE will go out, do an analysis based on that seed set and come back and say, okay, I've got these 5,000 documents that I'm greater than 90% confident are relevant to the case, right? And then we can focus our efforts on this set of documents, not exclusively, but it's a very good way to start. So we can do things like a communication analysis, right? So who are the folks involved conversing on these discussions? Do we have all these folks on hold? Visualizations, right? Conceptual groupings, right? So this is essentially a conceptual heat map. Each one of these nodes is a grouping of conceptually similar documents. The closer the nodes are, the more similar. The further out, the more unique. So
you can check with Lori and see.
Essentially uncovering the meaning of this corpus of data to really facilitate
see what David
the discovery process. I'm going to, you can page down here, Michael. And now we've got to, the 5% of content that are records, as well as that 25% that's in the active phase of this life cycle. So we can take feeds from the data remediation tools that I talked about, both structured and unstructured, right? So get that data out in the wild, get it under management. We can also just do it on an ongoing basis, right? So folks are creating documents. We can do information sharing, collaboration, check-in, check-out, version control, apply policy to this data. For records management, a good example is, my employee record at HP, right? When I was hired, there was emails going back and forth between my boss and myself. There was an offer letter on SharePoint, structured data in PeopleSoft, so our records management solution is able to bundle these all up, put them on a file plan, apply a retention, the deployment of Dominic Brown plus 10 units, really. So what we're doing here with this platform is we're really covering the breadth of the challenge that big data poses, right? So we're protecting data and controlling access to data to really thwart those insider threats. We're consolidating data sources and doing conceptual deep dives to mitigate eDiscovery costs and risk. And then we're remediating data via legacy data classification, policy management, and defensible deletion. And Michael, if you page down, we'll just flash the customer slide, and I think that we'll get into the question phase at that point. So this is just a sampling of some of our big data customers. And with that, Michael, I think I'll pass it back to you.
Very good, Dominic. Thank you very much. We would like to go right into Q&A, and we have received some questions so far. The first question is from Francis. Who or what group should actually own the information governance process? Could one assign this to a steering committee that acts on behalf of the enterprise on IT-related projects, for example? Dominic or Alan, do you want to take that?
I can take a crack at it, and Alan can chime in as well. I mean, what I typically see is sort of steering committee process where you've got a cross-functional team.
Okay.
So typically,
I'll get with Du Bois and see where we are.
Yeah, typically, I guess that's a little background. Typically, legal, compliance, information security, IT, records management would be the stakeholders, and they would initiate an information governance program.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't quite sure what the question was. Was it about the data in terms of creating an information governance policy for the organization, or about managing any particular document inside an information governance? And
yeah, I think it fundamentally goes to who owns the information governance process within the organization.
Well, I agree with Dominic. It's going to be a multi-factor thing. You need to have, certainly an IT component because you've got to actually achieve the goal. You're going to have a legal component because you're going to have to define and set the standard that you've got to meet. And then ultimately it's going to be owned by the board of directors who can be held liable and responsible for any failure of that one. So it's a wide sweeping top down approach. You've got to own at the top and deploy it all the way down.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Another question, very practical one. How long should my organization retain information that is not a record and that is not on legal hold?
So the standard sort of Harvard answer to that one is as long as you need to, but no longer. Right? I mean, you don't. If it's not something that you need to retain because it's not something required by law or anything else that you hold it, then you don't need to hold it. You can delete it. But if it serves a business purpose, then you want to hold it for as long as you need it, but then no longer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll build on that. And Alan's got real world expertise with this. What I've seen is a couple of things. One is obviously you want your folks to be able to do their jobs. So if you delete it too early, they're going to do sort of abnormal things like make copies and hide them away. I mean, PSTs are like that. The other thing is you want to keep it long enough for your legal hold process to sort of play itself out. So, I mean, it's a legal hold process can be a bureaucratic process. So, if you delete something in 20 days and your legal hold process takes 2 months to figure out what you got to put on hold, then you could be guilty of spoliation. So those are two major factors that you need to take into account.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
I mean, to be clear, I thought the question was not really in a litigation hold perspective, but yeah, if you're in litigation and the document is relevant to the dispute, now you don't need to hold it if it's not relevant to the dispute. If it's lunch in the cafeteria, you don't need to hold that document unless it's some crazy lawsuit about discrimination in the cafeteria over lunch. But I mean, absent that kind of extreme, case, if it's not involved in litigation, you can delete it any time. But if it's relevant to the dispute, then you got to keep it until the dispute is resolved.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Another question. For a company that has not had a formal information governance policy or practice, can we implement something different for new data than we do for existing documents?
Yes. I mean, none of this is required, right? So if you find that you're just overwhelmed by all the legacy data, you could come up with a disposition plan under records management for its eventual destruction after some period of time based upon some sort of classification, but then set a higher standard and a higher activity for new data that you have going forward. To Dominic's point about litigation holds, obviously if a litigation hold comes in, then that legacy data that you have from before, you have to address in the course of eDiscovery. But each year that goes by, if you can sort of cut the salami thinner and thinner and thinner, then you are resolving that problem and minimizing your cost and risk in that sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we have time for just one more question before we announce the winner of the Apple Watch or the gift certificate. Is there a specific information governance policy for dealing with HIPAA types of issues as opposed to other types of information governance issues?
I couldn't hear the middle part of that, Michael. Is there a specific type of information governance policy for what?
For HIPAA.
Well, yeah, there is. I mean, HIPAA has PHI and encryption requirements that other governance policies don't have, right? But it still sort of boils down to the three tenets, right? There's the confidentiality, protecting information, the integrity of the information, and the accessibility. So it has the common IT requirements and information management requirements. But it's a little different in that it requires that you examine the data and make sure that any PII and PHI and that type of thing is masked and encrypted.
Yeah, I mean, at least for our clients, I mean, many of them, what we're trying to do is develop a policy and information governance policy and practice that kind of takes a best-in-breed between HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, what all the different standards are to kind of thread that needle so you have one policy. Because many organizations have HIPAA data, have PCI data, have PII data, have all different types of data, and they don't really want to have, if they can avoid it, different policies for each. So you probably want to put the organization set up so that you're handling all your data to a same degree of confidentiality, and pick that part of HIPAA that's the most stringent, like Dominic was saying.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Well, that concludes our presentation. And again, I do apologize for all the technical issues we had. Dominic and Alan, thank you so much for your great content. We have randomly drawn the name of one registrant to the webinar, and that is Betsy with Bristol Myers Squibb. Congratulations, Betsy. We'll be in contact with you very shortly. I would like to thank everyone.